and welcome back. So we'll continue on to the next portion of the presentation. This portion of the presentation will be covering Criterion 4, community efforts and citizen participation. So the two presenters will be myself, Rosie Golich, the CDBG coordinator, and Jeanette Blyes, the outreach coordinator. Once again, take a moment to ensure that you are muted, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation or through the chat. Here's a brief agenda of what we will be covering today. First, we will review the ranking of Criterion 4. Then we will review the scoring of Criterion 4. We'll then provide real examples of documentation from applications that we have received. Last, we'll have time for any discussion and questions. Here are the criteria for ranking Criterion 4. There is a maximum of 100 total points or a level 5. When evaluating Criterion 4, these are the criteria. First, the applicant's overall long-term effects to improve the community over time, including efforts to secure federal, state, and local funds to address community needs. Second, the thoroughness of the applicant's past efforts to address community development and public facilities problems, specifically with local resources, including efforts of local volunteers and community service organizations. Third, other non-financial community efforts by the applicant to assure adequate and cost-effective community and public facilities. And lastly, documentation of the required public hearings. These criteria can be found on page 22 of our CDBG Public and Community Facilities Application Guidelines on our website, as well as the Criterion 4 questions. There are 5 scoring levels for ranking Criterion 4. Specific language describing each level is provided on page 14 in the CDBG Application Guidelines. Each ranking criteria in the application guidelines consists of specific questions requiring narrative responses and supporting documentation evidencing each of the claims made in the narrative responses. The 10 questions for Criterion 4 are provided on page 22 of the guidelines. A score level 3 is worth 60 points and is typically provided when the applicant meets the minimum intent of the criterion and does not demonstrate going above and beyond in their efforts when compared with the efforts of the other applicants. Staff review what is provided by each applicant within the pool against the others and determine the score levels based on the natural breaks within the pool. So for example, there's no set number of letters of support, social media posts, or petition signatures that earn an applicant a specific score level. In most cases, the ranking team has to look at what's provided and then we compare them against each other. So here you can see a summary of the score level descriptions for score levels 3 through 5. A level 5 is provided when the applicant provides a very complete narration to the 10 questions that thoroughly address the overall criterion with very complete substantive documentation to support its claims. A level 4 is provided when the narrative responses are solid with strong documentation to support its claims. And a level 3 is provided when we consider what is submitted to be adequate narrative, meeting the minimum requirements with acceptable documentation to support its claims. These are the score level descriptions for score levels 2 down to 0. Level 2 is given when there's some narrative addressing the overall criterion, but responses or documentation is considered weak, inadequate, and below average. Minimum requirements for responding to this criterion are not entirely met. And a level 1 results from a serious weakness in the narrative responses and lack of critical supporting documentation. There may be a lack of sufficient information regarding several critical questions. Level 0 would be provided if the applicant fails to provide a narrative response of any kind or would not meet a general statutory threshold requirement for the CDBG program that's related to the ranking criterion. So what does your community need to do to meet the minimum requirements of this ranking criterion? So looking at sort of what will get you in the middle of the road, adequate level 3 sort of territory. Number 1, we would recommend that you fully answer the 10 questions. So as I mentioned earlier, there's Criterion 4 questions start on page 22 of the application guidelines. So that will help a lot if you just provide responses to the questions. Second is that you would meet the intent of the 2 required public meetings. This is really, in my mind, the core of what we want to see when we're reviewing Criterion 4. There are 3 other criteria that we discussed at the beginning of this presentation that we will be looking at and wanting to see documentation of related to past efforts and overall community efforts, things like that. But we have put considerable effort into providing in our application guidelines. For example, in part 3, section F, starts at the bottom of page 7 of the application guidelines and carries over onto page 8. There's a section called public notice and participation that describes the requirement that all CDBG applicants must hold a minimum of 2 public hearings prior to submission of the CDBG application and describe in your narrative responses the intent. In the application guidelines, it also describes the intent of those 2 hearings. So you can be thinking now, and maybe already have been, about what efforts your community can make to fully meet the intent of the 2 hearings. The first meeting is your community needs assessment. And just to kind of pull directly from the guidelines, that language, the first public hearing provides a forum for considering overall community needs and potentially competing or alternative proposals for CDBG funding within the local government's jurisdiction. In order to ensure that public participation is relevant and timely, the overall community needs hearing should be held within 18 months prior to the date of application. So we're saying within the last year and a half, so that it's a considered fresh assessment of the community needs. The second hearing that's required is it must be held after the applicant's governing body has selected a specific proposed project for CDBG funding from that first overall assessment of community needs. So one project is selected by the applicant's governing body, and the purpose of the second hearing is to give the citizens and potential beneficiaries of the proposed CDBG project, especially low and moderate income persons or residents of the project area, adequate opportunity to consider the potential impacts and benefits of the community's proposed project and to comment on it before the community submits the application. So you have that language that I just referenced at the bottom of page 7 and all of page 8. And then there's also a really great narrative that's in the application guidelines in Appendix C, pages 36 through 38, that give a really great description of the intent of the first and second public hearings and also includes sample language for your public notice. So we try to provide as much just direct guidance as we possibly can, so that you can, go ahead and meet the intent as fully as possible for this criterion. Next slide, please. So it's the third, I guess, tip I would give to just sort of meet the minimum requirements then with relation to these hearings is to fully document the 2 required public meetings. And these are just some examples from past projects, just kind of what we will absolutely be looking for when we say meet the minimum requirements of the documentation that we need that demonstrates that the public hearings were held true to the intent of the hearings. So we typically look for these types of, I would say there's roughly 5-ish. They don't have to be exactly these types of documentation, but typically are and are very helpful. So definitely must include the affidavit of publication demonstrating that the hearings, both of the hearings, were publicly advertised. And the affidavit of publication includes a copy of the ad, so we can see the language that was in the ad, and we read those to make sure, we can see what was noticed, what was the public told the hearing would be about, and what kind of information were they given? When was the meeting held? Where was the meeting held? Did you think about the interests in meeting the needs of low and moderate income people in just even publicly noticing your meeting? We look at we would like to see a copy of the minutes from the meeting and any comments that may have been included from community members at that time. If any other comments were received via email or a log was kept from phone calls that were made, if sometimes the public is offered more opportunity to comment than just at the hearing. So, you might have comments in the minutes, but you might also have comments collected from other opportunities. Also the sign-in sheet from the meeting. And sometimes we've seen, and quite often now we see a copy of the presentation that's provided. This would be more likely maybe on the second hearing, but we see them with both. So the second hearing, when they actually overview what the project is that's been selected. For reference, these are just some examples of what the documentation typically looks like. But we are looking absolutely for that affidavit of publication and minutes and any kind of any documentation that backs up the narrative that's explaining how you complied with the 2 hearings. And we also ask for ease of reference for us that any documentation that's related to the applicant's narrative responses that are included in the 10 questions, the responses to the 10 questions in this ranking criterion, that they be placed in the application immediately following the applicant's narrative response. So please do not reference another portion of the application, such as the PER, without including a narrative statement that at least provides a summary of what's being referenced.
Okay, we will now show examples of community efforts and citizen participation that go above and beyond the minimum requirements of CDBG regulation. As Jeanette earlier stated, please review pages 8 and 22 and others of our CDBG community and public facilities application guidelines for more details. To separate your application from the rest and earn the maximum score of 100 points or a level 5, we encourage creative ways of eliciting feedback from your community. This might include incorporating social media or other forms of outreach to include community members who have historically not participated in public hearings. Think about the unique features and demographics of your community. What established community groups exist that you want to participate depending on the nature of your project? For example, are there neighborhood groups or specific nonprofit organizations that serve community members that are directly affected by your project. This can be either for a community or public facilities project. Build relationships with the nonprofits in the community who serve your area that work with low to moderate income individuals in your community and how best to serve them. Encourage not just the staff of these organizations or volunteers of the organizations to attend public meetings, but also the individuals that they serve to share their lived experience and how they will be directly affected by this project. Here are some additional examples that quote go above and beyond. So for example, in Wolf Point, they were able to collect 290 petition signatures. And when it has a total, Wolf Point, excuse me, has a total population of 2,755. So that's over 10% of the population. We have some sign-in sheets from Winnet, which is 60 out of 443 total residents attended, which I would consider pretty good pretty good numbers. And letters of support. Letters of support demonstrate the community backing your project. Organizations and public officials writing letters is great, but hearing directly from residents impacted by your project goes above and beyond. Even if it's a form letter that several community members all sign, this tells us about the greater community support behind this project. There are other additional ways of creative engagement, which include the first needs assessment surveys. Through websites like Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, and others, people who are not able to attend an in-person meeting can still have their voice heard. Utilize existing e-newsletters, websites, and social media to make sure that the survey gets out. Also, if you are holding a virtual public hearing as well, make sure to include these same requirements. The next is community feedback surveys. So through in the paper or online, mailing surveys, hanging on doorknobs, make sure that we also make sure on this note that in your application, you include the survey tool, distribution methodology, and your response rate as well. You can also partner with local schools for the flyer distribution. We had a community who, there was a public hearing coming up and they put a flyer in backpacks to make sure that the parents receive the flyer. Just one example, or posting it in your local school as well, at PTA meetings, things like that. Physical flyers posted around town in places like the library, the grocery stores, schools and community and senior centers, where affected residents gather. So if there are bulletin boards, making sure that it's not just posted in the required locations around your community, but also other additional spots where community members gather. In addition to the required public notice in the newspaper, make sure to invite media to attend public hearings and public meetings to further promote community engagement. For example, they can take pictures and potentially have a little article in your local newspaper about the public hearing and about the project that you are attempting to fund. If you, once again, if any of this, additional articles or anything occurs, please add this to your application. When we read applications, it is great when we hear about all the community outreach and the efforts that the community is doing. It strengthens your application even further, really goes above and beyond when we get to see it physically in your application. Yes, okay. Also include any flyers, posters, where they were posted, pictures of community meetings. So for example, on this slide, you'll see in the Winnet Community Center, they have little dots and stickers next to certain options. And, we do look at this as documentation of community meetings and community involvement and efforts. Please also document your outreach methods, not just describing them. It is very important to receive a full score once they get going above and beyond. Sign-in sheets and minutes. So you'll see here that there was a water project in looks like Circle. That is a sign-in sheet of the attendees. A petition, excuse me. And then you'll also see social media posts documenting the details of the meeting itself, and the proposed project. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for attending today. As a reminder, these slides and the recording of the presentation will be on our website. If you need an alternative form of either these slides or a transcript of this meeting, please call 406-841-2770, or you can email docccdd@mt.gov. We will now open the floor for questions. You can either unmute yourself or enter them into the chat. I do want to say before we get started on questions, just a reminder of the next training in the series is next Wednesday, July 19th at 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. Gus Byram and myself will be presenting on Criterion 6, which is low to moderate income documentation and income surveys. So does anyone have any questions?
I have an extra comment.
Yeah, I would.
Sure does.
That's my.
Yeah, I would offer also the, what I call the Missoula County model is that like Missoula County in January regularly holds that needs assessment hearing in partnership with the city of Missoula. So, and I believe Kalispell and Flathead County have done that from time to time, as well as Helena and Lewis and Clark County. So it's just an excellent example of close government, local government cooperation. And it's easier for your low and moderate income folks to come and articulate their needs at one general needs hearing.
Yeah, and as Gus is saying, and then it just becomes something that all of the partners that do serve low and moderate income people, all the NGOs that are out there, nonprofits and organizations that serve low and moderate income persons, they are used to that calendar, scheduled, regular, every January. They're ready with all the needs, that ideas that they've been having, and we really do want the needs assessment forum to be an opportunity to just vet and air all the ideas. So it's really just a great opportunity to get all the ideas out on the table and not have it be a kind of situation where a community is sort of picking their pet project and then trying to sort of plan backwards to try to make it be selected by the community sort of in a backwards route. And we can, it is really easy to see that when it's happening in the documentation. So it's not that, it's better than nothing, but I think when we talk about meeting the intent of the first and second hearing, that's really what we're trying to get at is, did you fully assess the needs of that community? And then did you invite all the partner organizations and all the people who really do have ideas about housing, about parks, about, all the things that really matter to different community members, and especially low and moderate income people? Did you give them a real opportunity to bring those ideas forward? And then a real opportunity for the, the community leadership to see, okay, this is clearly the project that we need to select because it's number one on everybody's radar.
I'm not seeing any online questions in the chat.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are ending early. But if anyone has any further questions, comments, I do also want to mention as we move through this process that the next application deadline for the CDBG Community and Public Facilities Projects is Wednesday, October 4th. So if there are no other questions, Feel free, once again, if you want to review the slides or watch these presentations again, they will be available on our website, which is condev.mt.gov. And yeah, I will let everyone have a great afternoon. Thanks everyone for attending.